Good evening, everyone. We are about to get started. We'll just give everyone just 1 minute just to see if there's any stragglers signing in. I know I always have trouble signing in. Technology is not my friend, so we'll give a little bit of grace and then we'll get started. And while we're waiting, I'll just say that I hope everyone made it through the blizzard in Saskatchewan yesterday and is staying warm today. We're going from one extreme of weather to the next. So I hope everyone is safe and well and warm. Alrighty. Maybe we can go ahead and get started. I'll first introduce myself. I'm Georgia LaValle, and I'm the Executive Director of the Saskatchewan Early Childhood Association. We have a few others on the call, which I'll introduce right away here. I'll just first start with the land acknowledgement. And so we respectfully acknowledge the land on which we gather is situated on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 lands. We recognize all Indigenous people who were here before us, those who live with us now, and the 7 generations to come. As Indigenous people have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. These are the territories of the Cree, Saulteaux, Stoney, Nakota, Dakota, and the homeland of the Métis Michif Nation. Today, these lands continue to be shared territory and is occupied by many diverse peoples from near and far. A treaty is an inheritance, a responsibility, and a relationship. So welcome, everyone. We are so excited to have you join us tonight. So along with the Saskatchewan Leaders Caucus, which we have representation, who is Karen Duff, who's joining us tonight as well, we're happy to have you join Don Giesbrecht, the CEO of the Canadian Child Care Federation, Morna Ballantyne, the Executive Director of Child Care Now, and Christopher Smith, the Associate Executive Director of the Muttart Foundation. And so these, 3 very experienced, knowledgeable individuals will be sharing some information with you regarding the roadmap to a quality system in Saskatchewan and how that might look in the next little while. So with that, I am going to pass it on to Don, and he'll just explain the platform a little bit and continue on with the continue on with the presentation.
Great, thanks so much, Georgia, and good evening, everybody. So great, there's almost, I think almost 40 of you on the webinar here tonight, which is just fantastic. So I'm sure all of you are old pros at doing webinars, and so, you know, I don't have to explain a lot, but just a few things for you. As you know, your mics are muted throughout the entire webinar, and we do want it, though, to be as engaging as possible with you. And so if you do have questions, there is on your control panel a question section. Please type in a question. If we're not answering what's on your mind, or you just have something related to what we're talking about tonight, please let us know, and we'll get to that at the end. We won't stop during the webinar itself or during the presentation itself, but we'll get to it at the end. So please do that. So we're each going to take a turn presenting tonight. We're going to start with Chris and then move over to Morna, and then I will do the last few slides. So with that, Chris, I will start the presentation. Just give me a moment here, and I will we didn't determine this, but I will move slides along as we're speaking here tonight as well too. All right.
Thanks, Don. I appreciate that. And again, we'll welcome everybody to the webinar, and thank you for taking time out of your busy evening to listen in or watch in. I wish we were doing it in person. I was on a meeting this morning with Georgia and Angie and others from SACRA, and we were talking about, wouldn't it be great if we were all sitting together in a room somewhere and talking about or even childcare, but we're not. We're going to sit and talk about it virtually, so we'll make that work the best way we can. And so so this evening, if I can get the second slide, Don, what Don and Morna and I are going to do is talk broadly to the roadmap to a quality early learning childcare system in Saskatchewan. We're going to cover 4 kind of related areas. We're going to start off. I'm going to start off the presentation. So we're going to start. I'm the opener. I think we're doing a boy, girl, boy thing. I think is that. Hopefully I've got that right. So I'm going to start off, talk for a few slides, and I'm going to hand it off to Morna, who's going to talk more in detail about the roadmap, and then Morna in turn is going to hand it to Don, who's going to talk to the roadmap in more detail. So as part of the presentation, we're going to talk initially about the federal budget, just go back and touch base with what the federal budget included, its significance and its major content. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the Canada-Saskatchewan Early Learning and Childcare System Building Agreement, the agreement that Saskatchewan has signed as part of that system building work. Then we're going to turn specifically to the policy roadmap, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at the roadmap. If you haven't, don't worry, you'll have a chance to look at it afterwards. And then finally, as the final part of the session, we'll just look ahead a little bit and say how we hope the roadmap can be used to support system building work. And then we'll, at the end, we'll have time for your questions, comments, observations. So if I can get the next slide, please, Don. So we're going to start off just touching base back, looking at the federal budget. I mean, it seems like a long while ago. Federal budget was released or announced or presented on April the 19th, 2021. It was an historic budget in terms of the investments in early learning and childcare. So you'll see on this slide there, the new investments actually total over $30 billion. So the $27.2 billion over the next 5 years are investments in provincial and territorial governments, and then there are also additional monies for Indigenous early learning and childcare. But as part of the budget, there were a number of people, myself included, we were in the virtual lockup. When you get the budget documents a little bit early and you have a chance to skim through them. And I think all of us, those of us who are from the early learning and childcare field, we were taken aback by the size of the investment and the size of the federal government's commitment to early learning and childcare. So these are historic federal investments, and they really signal, if you look at the budget as a whole, this was the largest single budget item in terms of the investment. So the federal government quite clearly said early learning and childcare is central to our budget, to our policy agenda moving forward. And if you look at the second point, why did the federal government do that? Well, why has the federal government put such a large investment in early learning and childcare? And part of the key is in the answer, in the title of the budget itself. I think you've all probably seen now, budget documents are now given names. They're given sort of titles or descriptors that analyze or present what they're intended to do. And this federal budget is a recovery plan for jobs, growth, and resilience. And the federal government keyed in that as part of the post-pandemic economic and social recovery, early learning and childcare was going to be a central part of the social infrastructure that allowed the country to move forward, that allowed women and parents to get into the workforce, and supported children in their development and well-being. So early learning and childcare was the central pillar, the central column, the central piece in that federal budget. And that's almost an historic development in and of itself. So as part of the federal budget, what the federal government has said it wants to do is that it wants to work collaboratively with provincial and territorial governments to literally transform early learning and childcare sectors. If I can just flip back one slide, thanks, Don. And what that means is, in some ways, what we're seeing is the Canadian Federation in potential full swing here. We're seeing the federal commitment, the federal spending power, allied with provincial area of jurisdiction, early learning and childcare, to really move early learning and childcare forward, and essentially to transform what we have in terms of a series of early learning and childcare sectors into a pan-Canadian early learning and childcare system. So it's very much about the federal government working collaboratively with provincial and territorial governments to bring about the change that is necessary to support early learning and childcare. And what the federal government recognized, and to be honest, it spent a lot of time working with individuals like Dawn and Mona and Martha Friendly and others, and really trying to understand from the childcare community itself what was needed to advance early learning and childcare. And what the federal government was able to grasp is that if we're looking at how we make childcare more affordable, if we're looking at how we make childcare more accessible, and if we're looking at how we may ensure that early learning childcare is of high quality, then what we need to do, we need to approach it in a very, very different way. We need to move away from what we call a market-based model, where the access parents have to childcare depends really on where they live, how old their children are, and how much they can afford to pay, to something that we would understand as a system, where all families have equitable access to high quality, affordable early learning and childcare, and all staff who work in that system are qualified and well supported for their important work. So we are essentially talking about transformational change. And transformational change, it's an amazing opportunity. It's what many of the advocates have called for close to 50 years, actually, 30, 40 years, some of them longer. But with that transformational change, it's an opportunity, but it's also a challenge. It's a challenge that I think the sector's up for. So essentially, the budget laid out a plan to transform early learning and childcare in Canada over the next 5 years and onwards. If I can get the next slide, please, Don. And so as part of that plan, as part of that collaboration between the federal, provincial, and territorial governments, what each provincial and territorial government is being asked to do is to sign a system building agreement with the federal government. And so as you're probably aware at the moment, all of the provinces except Ontario have signed, and the other outstanding territory is Nunavut, which also hasn't signed, but I've heard some sort of suggestion that Nunavut will be signing in the very near future, and so that will leave Ontario as a province without an agreement. So each of the provinces have signed similar agreements in terms of the focus. The focus is on affordability, the focus is on expanding services, the focus is on ensuring quality, and it's all about doing that through building a system. And so Saskatchewan signed its agreement on Friday, August the 13th. It was the 8th province to sign an agreement, and it signed an agreement literally on the Friday before the election call came on the Sunday. And so Saskatchewan came in very quickly after Manitoba. Manitoba was the first of the prairie provinces to sign about a day or two earlier. Then Saskatchewan signed on August the 13th, and then Alberta, where we're based, signed on November the 15th. So Saskatchewan's agreement is public. I would encourage you to look at the agreement. What you will see as part of the agreement is a detailed action plan, which outlines how the government of Saskatchewan is going to approach building that early learning and childcare system that's going to transform services in the province. The federal investments, the second bullet there, the federal investments over the next 5 years are significant. $1.1 billion in new federal investments in early learning and childcare to build this Saskatchewan, Canada early learning and childcare system. And those level of investments, they actually increase throughout the 5 years of the agreement. So in the first year of the agreement, we're seeing a federal investment of just over $114 million. And over the 5 years of the agreement, that investment increases to $316 million. But that level of federal investment, what that federal investment means is that the federal government is actually the senior funding partner for early learning and childcare in Saskatchewan. So as of year one of the agreement, the federal government is the senior funding partner. If you think back to the provincial budget for childcare, if you look at the provincial plan when it's developed, you see in the provincial guidelines about $73.5 million provincially. And now we're adding $114 million federally. And we're also, if you see the third bullet there, these investments under the Canada-Saskatchewan System Building Agreement, these are in addition to the existing Canada-Saskatchewan bilateral agreement funding. So Saskatchewan's been receiving about $14 million a year in bilateral funding, and these new federal monies are added on top of that. So you've got something like close to $130 million in federal funding available in 21-22 to support that process of system building. So these are very significant investments. So I was talking to a group this morning, and I said it's very rare in Saskatchewan, probably almost unheard of, when we're talking about early learning and childcare, and the word billion is included when we're talking about investments. We generally don't, we might talk about tens of millions, we might talk about even 100 million in some sense, but I've never heard the word $1 billion used in terms of investments in early learning and childcare. So this is really exciting times. The action plan that the Saskatchewan government's developed, and all of the governments that sign agreements develop action plans. It's the Saskatchewan government's action plan commits it to build a system. And the initial action plan included as part of the agreement, that's for 2 years. So there's going to be an initial action plan for 2 years. You see 20, 21, 22, and 22, 23. And then there will be a second action plan developed to take us through the final 3 years of the agreement. And the first action plan, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide, that includes investments of about 294 million. So if those of you who are doing the quick math, what you will see is in the first action plan that covers the first 2 years of the agreement, we're talking about, so let's say $300 million to to make it nice, easy math. And so the second action plan will actually be for the larger investment of $800 million. So the first action plan, first 2 years, 1 year is almost over, 294 million, then an additional $800 million in the second action plan, which is to be developed. If I can get the next slide, please, Don. So the first action plan, and again, I would encourage you to read it. I think it's fairly well laid out. And what you'll see there under that first part of the slide, you'll see the kind of major areas of commitment. So what the action plan does, it says, let's look at the $294 million in new federal investments, and let's see how it's going to be apportioned between the areas, the priority areas. So you'll see under the first bullet, affordability is the first area. Now, it seems to be that's, if you look at the numbers, those of you who are good at math will say, yeah, 219 million of 295, that's about 75% of the funding. So the bulk of the funding in the first 2 years is going to be allocated to support reductions in parent fees. We're talking about an average reduction in parent fees of 50% in the first year, 21, 22, and then as we move towards year 5, the goal is to reduce the average parent fee, the average paid portion of the parent fee, to $10 a day. So very significant initial investments. You've seen, you've experienced those announcements of the parent fee reduction grants, and you're well aware that what the provincial government has decided also to do is to make some of that funding retroactive. So parents who had used childcare throughout the second half of 2021 will also receive a refund for those fees that they previously paid. So a real focus on affordability. And again, that's the same across the agreement. So that's not unique to Saskatchewan. The second area is access, and what it means by access is how do we actually grow and expand regulated early learning and childcare services for children 0 to 6, so that we get to a point where families do have more equitable access. Because what we know, Saskatchewan is one of those provinces with the lowest levels of current service in terms of access. So Saskatchewan across the province prior to this investment, there was around 17,600 licensed regulated childcare spaces. That includes center-based childcare and family day home and group family childcare. Those spaces, those 17,600 spaces, the plan in the first 2 years of the agreement is to add 12,100 new spaces. That is a very, very ambitious goal, to add those new spaces in the first 2 years. The longer term strategy is to actually add 28,000 new spaces. So again, that's an incredibly ambitious, aspirational target to think about expanding spaces that much. But what the government's trying to do federally and provincially is trying to ensure that early learning and childcare is available to all families, all of those families that need it and want it, rather than being available to a smaller number of families depending on where they live, the age of the child, and their ability to pay. The third area, there is some money dedicated to inclusion. And the Saskatchewan government's defined inclusion very broadly. So in terms of that definition of inclusion, it's certainly including young children who have exceptional needs, what we might have thought of as special needs or described as special needs in the past. But it's also looking at inclusion much more broadly in terms of populations from different backgrounds, economically, socially. And there's also a very important specific commitment within the Saskatchewan Agreement to work with First Nations and Métis partners to develop a coordinated early learning childcare system for Métis and First Nation children and families. And so again, inclusion is referenced. And then the fourth area relates to quality. And the money in quality, $15.7 million. Much of the discussion around quality in this initial action plan relates to supporting early child educators in terms of their commitments to compensation support, the development of the building, the size, expanding the size of the workforce. If you look at that bullet above, if you're going to create 12,100 new spaces, then you're going to need a significant new number of early child educators, and you're going to need a significant new number of family childcare providers. So in quality, there's money for compensation, including a commitment to develop a wage grid, and there's also dedicated funds for education and professional learning. And then last November, there was an initial announcement, wage enhancements, the ECEs. I'm not sure it was necessarily particularly well considered, but those actually monies that we use for those wage enhancements, that's actually bilateral monies. That's actually not system building money. So there are commitments to the workforce under quality, clearly recognizing that you cannot provide high quality early learning childcare without well qualified, well supported ECEs and well qualified, well supported family childcare providers. You cannot do it, and that's essential to moving forward. So if I was just to try to take one step back and look at the bottom bullet and say, well, what do we take from that initial action plan? Well, that action plan covers the major areas as we would have anticipated. But the focus is clearly on affordability with very aspirational targets for expansion. And it's probably a little bit modest in terms of its support for the improving and investing in the workforce. And what's also apparent is that that initial action plan, whilst it includes commitments to consult and engage stakeholders around a workforce strategy, around expansion, around inclusion, the initial action plan wasn't really developed with a lot of consultation with the field. And so that's kind of a little bit disappointing. And what we hope is that as the action plan unfolds and those strategies develop, that stakeholders like early childhood educators, like family childcare providers, you will be consulted and engaged to bring forward your ideas of what's needed. And when we get to the second action plan, year 3, then we will have an action plan that really reflects the input. So how will that input be shaped? Well, I'm going to turn that over to Mona to talk about the policy roadmap, which gives some indications of what might be important to express. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chris. I want to, before I begin, let you know that I'm actually joining you from Ottawa. And I want to acknowledge that Ottawa is situated on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. So I'll pick up from where Chris left off. And so, you know, as Chris said, the federal government in its 2021 budget made some pretty bold promises. They promised to build a Canada-wide system of early learning and childcare. They allocated a lot of money to the project over the next 5 years and on an ongoing basis. They, since the budget, the federal government has entered into agreements, what they're calling Canada-wide system building agreements, or it goes by different names in different jurisdictions. And, you know, together, the federal and provincial governments have undertaken to make some pretty big changes. And as Chris said, the Saskatchewan agreement sets out some specific goals and some numerical goals, but it doesn't necessarily, and in any great detail, say, well, how is this going to happen? How are we going to go from what we have now in Saskatchewan to a much more universally accessible and high quality, affordable system of early learning and childcare, one that includes all children. And so, and it's going to take, we know it's going to take a long time. So already the federal and provincial governments are anticipating 2 phases of change in the next 5 years, and there will no doubt be more phases beyond the 5-year period. So we thought it would be important to, and by we, there's 6 organizations that led this project, the Canadian Childcare Federation and the Saskatchewan Leaders Caucus, Childcare Now, which is the organization I represent, which is Canada's National Childcare Advocacy Association, and we've been around since 1982, advocating for transformative change in early learning and childcare. And we have a new Saskatchewan chapter of Childcare Now, and SICA and the Muttart Foundation came together as 6 organizations that know quite a bit about early learning and childcare and system change, and have a lot of passion to make sure that this project, and a big commitment to make sure that this project is going to work. So we came together and thought, well, the Saskatchewan government doesn't have all the answers. The federal government doesn't have all the answers. There's going to be a lot of consultation, hopefully, over the next 5 years, and around how the program should be built. And what would be helpful is to come to sort of put together our own ideas on paper, our own guide about how you go about making this kind of change in Saskatchewan. So that's really what this roadmap document is about. And we drew on, as I said, our own expertise. We drew on in developing the roadmap. A lot of research and evidence has been collected over many years, decades, in Canada and also internationally. So we wanted to build this roadmap, or put together ideas and frame them on the best evidence and best practices, especially of countries and jurisdictions where they have really effective, successful systems of early learning and childcare. And we also, of course, wanted to draw on the experience and expertise of both those who work in the sector in Saskatchewan and also other communities who are going to really benefit from a really healthy and robust system of early learning and childcare, and communities who actually have, not benefited from the lack of a really comprehensive system of childcare. So we engaged stakeholders, had consultations, and that's how this roadmap came to be written and came to be published. Our roadmap outlines 27 policy actions. And by policy actions, it's really what we want the Saskatchewan government to do at a policy level and at a funding level to be able to actually transform how early learning and childcare is regarded in Saskatchewan, how it's organized, how it's funded, how it's delivered. And it sets out what a system should look like at a policy level, at a high level, sort of, again, what the government has to do to actually make change. Because the kind of changes that we're talking about, the kind of changes that are necessary to actually make early learning and childcare truly accessible, universally accessible, to really make a big difference in terms of the quality of the programs, to make sure that they are inclusive. These are not things that can be done on a center-to-center basis, or each provider doing things a little bit differently. Things really have to be done differently at a system level. So these 27 policy actions speak to system change. And they cover the roadmap covers 4 main areas. First of all, we look at, and I'm going to get into this, and so is John, so what ideas and visions should be guiding the system change. We also look at the need for governments to engage in policy planning and the management of the services. Again, I'm going to get that go into that in more detail with the next slide and the next 2 slides. And then we look at how a new system, a reformed, transformed system should be financed. And then very importantly, what policies are necessary to actually support the workforce, which is critical, the early childhood education workforce in its entirety, educators and others who work in the childcare sector. What does government have to do to actually make sure that the workforce, that people who work in childcare, that's all of you, I'm sure, are able to succeed in the work, and also to make sure that programs are of the highest quality. The roadmap, in writing the roadmap, we were very conscious that systems change, transformation doesn't happen quickly, and it doesn't happen easily. It requires a lot of time, and it's not going to be successful unless the government consults widely and listens carefully, and then acts on the advice that it's getting, and acts on what its actions are based on the real lived experience of those who work in the sector, of parents, and of those who live in communities that will also benefit through system change. And just to give you an example, and not to discourage anybody, but when we look at countries that really have successful early learning and childcare systems, take Sweden, for example. It took actually 30 years to build a system that makes high quality early learning and childcare available to every family, every child in the country who wants it. So it's just like our public education systems and our healthcare systems. They need to be constantly reviewed. They need to be constantly improved. And that's certainly going to be the case for early learning and childcare as well. So we'll just go to the next slide to get into some of the detail, the content of the roadmap and our policy actions. I'm going to speed it up. You really encourage you to read the roadmap and look at each of these sections. It's well laid out, and to really focus on these policy actions. And I'm just going to highlight a few. So one of the things we know, again, from countries that have successful systems of early learning and childcare, and it's something that was brought to Canada's attention when childcare in Canada was reviewed by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, more than quite a long time ago now, certainly more than a decade ago. What was brought to the attention is that to build a system, governments really have to have a clear idea about what their vision is for early learning and childcare, and what are the guiding principles of the system. And so our roadmap recommends a new vision and guiding principles for early learning and childcare in Saskatchewan. And key is that we think that it's absolutely critical that early learning and childcare be seen as a public good, and that it be the responsibility for services, making sure that services are in place, making sure that the workforce is properly supported, making sure that the programs are inclusive and responsive to community needs. That is a responsibility of government. And so those are critical views that we see, that our position is that this responsibility has to shift from providers, from individuals and families and those who work in the sector to make sure it's all working well. That responsibility is to shift to government, that really only government is capable of being able to carry on the full burden of the project and make sure it's done right. And after all, that's why we have governments. Governments are there to do what is very difficult to do on an individual basis, or community, community by community, or center to center and so forth. So we're really saying the government has to take responsibility, and it's really important that the government commit and build a system that says that early learning and childcare is going to be high quality, will be accessible and affordable for all children and their families, and that the system is there to primarily be about the well-being and the development and the early learning of children. And of course, the system is going to have other benefits, important benefits, like contribute to gender equity by ensuring that programs and services are in place, especially for mothers, so that they can participate in the paid labor force. And of course, it's also going to be really important for the early learning and childcare system to be seen as something that is crucial for the inclusion and social cohesion, bringing people together. We depend on public systems to do that, bring people together, and this concept of we have systems, we have public services, we have social support programs to really build community and a sense of belonging, and that we want that to be part of the vision of early learning and childcare as well. Central to the vision that we think the government has to adopt is recognition that early childhood educators have to be qualified, fairly compensated, and they have to have good working conditions, that is central to making the system work. The other thing that we make note of in the roadmap is how important it is for early learning and childcare to recognize the system, to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples, and to make the building of an early learning and childcare system part of truth and reconciliation, a process that we must all be committed to in everything we do, and the government must be committed to in everything it does. And that means respect and support for the self-determination of Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples, and be supportive and make sure that Indigenous children and families have equal access to the same high quality and equal equitable services as well. Another important piece in the roadmap is that we say that this vision and these commitments and these guiding principles have to be embedded in law. There actually has to be some changes to the legislation, and that's important in large part because if something is in legislation, then government has an obligation. Also, government has to be accountable to making it happen, and also it's much more difficult when governments change for what's put in legislation to be taken away. It's not impossible. We know that. We know that from other experiences in Saskatchewan and across Canada, that legislation, laws can be repealed, progress can be pushed back, but it is much more difficult to do that if rights are set out in law. So let's just go to the next slide. So the other important thing, and this is a sort of recurring theme in everything we say about our roadmap and what we say about system change with respect to early learning and childcare, is that again, government has to take responsibility, and it has to for the supply of early learning and childcare services, and it has to be organized to take responsibility for the supply. So government has to actually move childcare from the market and actually treat early learning and childcare as a public good and as a public service. And to do that, what we're saying is that the entire government, the Ministry of Education for sure, but all areas of government have to work together to make that happen. So we're called for a whole of government approach. You know, that there are many facets to building a system. There are going to be many departments, ministries that will have to be involved. For example, if we want to ensure that there is an adequate supply of qualified, credentialed early childhood educators that are credentialed through the post-secondary system, those in government who are responsible for post-secondary education, ensuring proper funding and so forth, need to be involved in the building of a childcare project. If we're looking at making sure that facilities are that there's more early learning and childcare offered in public facilities, which is one of the things that we need to be considered, then we have to make sure that those in government who are responsible for facilities are involved and thinking also about early learning and childcare. So we're looking for a whole of government approach. Very importantly, in our roadmap, we speak about the need for government to be actively engaged in expanding the number of licensed spaces in Saskatchewan, and that, Chris mentioned the commitment through the agreement signed between the Saskatchewan government and the Government of Canada is significant with respect to expansion. We're talking about 28,000 spaces in 5 years. That's a lot of spaces. It's more than doubling very quickly the capacity of the sector, the number, and that means a lot more educators and so forth. It is going to be a big challenge. In fact, a much bigger challenge, I would suggest, than bringing down parent fees, which is more of a funding challenge. If you're talking about actually expanding the system, you have to think about facilities. You have to think about making sure that there's sufficient supply of early childhood educators, administrators, other support staff for the system. You have to really think through where should the priority. We can't expand everywhere once. So which communities should be where should the expansion happen, and which communities should be put as a priority? Who is going to do the expansion? How will it be governed, and so forth? These are very complicated things. So we call for the government to actually put together a multi-year expansion strategy. You can't leave it to chance. To a large extent in Canada, the provision or the supply of early learning and childcare has really been left to chance. It's been put on the shoulders of individual or organizations or providers to set up to basically set up their own services or expand their own services. We want the government to be much more actively engaged, and it's the only way it's going to happen. So we call, for example, in developing an expansion strategy, call for the active engagement of municipal governments, and also to explore new partnerships with school divisions. We also say when you're looking at expansion, you have to really look at all the potential there is, for example, of bringing preschools and school age programs into the new system or connecting them to the new system. Aligning pre-kindergarten with community-based childcare is another important, and also we have to look at models of family childcare. Where does family childcare fit into a system? And if it's going to be expanded, how is it done in a way that will ensure, again, high quality programs and supportive programs? All of this, and Chris has said this, is going to require public input and participation of the early learning and childcare community and beyond. So that is all the things that we call for in brief, set out in 10 recommended policy actions that relate to what we call public planning and management of the new system. So Don, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Morna, and good evening again, everybody. I'm speaking to you today from Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples in the homeland of the Métis Nation. So thanks so much, Morna and Chris, for everything so far. And so I'm going to get into a little bit more of what both Morna and Chris have said, building on the roadmap, and then get specifically into the workforce and what has to happen specific to all of you, which is really important, obviously, as both Morna and Chris have emphasized. And Morna just said something before I go on that's so important, so incredibly important, and we've been saying this for years. And that is, you can't leave it to chance. It has to be done by design. Canada's early learning and care system and Saskatchewan's early learning and childcare system has gotten to where it is by chance. It is from the benevolence of families and communities and and good leadership, etc., in how programs have started. But that is not a way to build a system, right? We all know that. And we know that when it's left to chance, we end up with what we have today, which is, I think Morna might have said it, or if not, maybe Chris did, but it's that patchwork of services, right? It's just language we've used all along in this sector. And rather than a comprehensive set of services. And that is just such an important defining piece of this. This is, as they both said, so transformative. And so when we talk then about the planning, to segue into that, the public policy and the planning and the management of services, within the roadmap, there are 10 policy actions in there. And by the way, I should also mention to you as well that in your control panel, we did put 2 handouts. One is the roadmap itself, so it's there in PDF form, and the other is this presentation. We've put that there in PDF form. However, we will also send this out this week to all of you as well. We'll send out the links, so if you don't get them today, don't worry, we will send them out to you further. And so, I think as Morna has been saying, and Chris as well, just with regards to how to, continuing on how do we do this, and of course, getting into the money of it. Chris laid that out, I think, in the first couple of slides. But that is really the heart of it, right? And you're seeing that roll out right now in Saskatchewan already, with regards to parent fees and with regards to building some semblance of salary floors for everybody who works in the sector. But we know that approach, the approach that's happened in the years past, of again, doing the same thing, which is by chance rather than by design and purposeful system building, doesn't leave us where we need to go. So one of the things that's so important to this process is funding the service. Right now, and as both Chris and Morna spoke about, fees in Saskatchewan, and really frankly, fees across most of Canada, are so unaffordable for families. And that's just been one of the byproducts of the fact that we rely on a market system to support childcare. And by contrast, right, we don't rely on a market system to support the education system or the healthcare system, just as two other, parallels. So we need to move, Saskatchewan needs to move to direct funding of services. Right now, a lot of childcare, and I'm mixing it up here a little bit in terms of how this works, but most of Canada and Saskatchewan's no different. Rely on subsidies, right? If a family doesn't make a certain amount of money, whatever that guideline is provincially, there are subsidies to support them. But we all know that that is a challenge because subsidy models generally don't get indexed with inflation. They don't keep up with the cost of living. And it just keeps on perpetuating that market model, if you will. And so what has to happen is that we need to develop a cost-based funding formula for childcare programs and for family childcare. Everybody's unique, right? Some people pay a lot of rent. Some people don't pay a lot of rent. Some people pay, a lot in utilities or whatever their overhead happens to be. I know in Saskatchewan, one of the issues that has been a thorn in the side of the sector is the issue of property taxes and where that fits in, and it depends on what community you're in Saskatchewan, whether you're paying property taxes. But the point is that everybody's economic reality, their budgets, if you will, are different. So we need to, as we build out a system, think through that and figure out how to fund childcare equitably so that everybody is really, the language I like to use is playing from the same songbook and is starting from the same level rather than disparities from one program to another program. Maybe this program is really good at fundraising. Maybe this program's in a community that's a little more economically disadvantaged. That shouldn't make a difference in terms then of how the service is being funded. And then, of course, as we expand, I don't know if you took note of when Chris and Morna were saying it, like in the initial forays into the system building, over 12,000 new spaces. And you may be looking and thinking right now, oh my goodness, we have enough challenges staffing ourselves right now and keeping up with what is in our sector right now. That's really fair. That's really fair to say that. And so we need to look at then, as we're expanding it, how are we doing that? Are we going into and building childcare and creating spaces in areas that really need childcare and making sure it's done equitably? Those hard to serve areas, those rural, remote areas, and in other communities as well, in terms of reaching the need to make sure that every family and every child has an opportunity for access to high quality care. Within that, then, we also need to figure out what is affordability. And both Chris and Morna have spoken about this, and that is clearly the mantra and the policy goal, if you will, of the federal government is that families in Canada pay no more than an average of $10 a day for their care by the end of 2025, 2026. So trying to make it very affordable. And the key word there is average in terms of how that's going to be approached. But we've seen governments who have signed these agreements really embrace that language, as Morna talked about, and that's really kind of been the talking point for many of them, and certainly within the media as well. But within that, then, let's be honest that for some families, $10 a day is still too expensive. It's still too much for them to afford. So if it is to a goal of an average of $10 a day, what does it look like for someone who cannot afford $10 a day? That's one of those pieces that we have to think through, and to tie it in, then certainly we're also then not talking about subsidizing them, but creating some sort of geared to income scale, sliding fee scale, right? So perhaps it is zero. Maybe some families pay nothing. Maybe other families pay $1 a day per child. But somehow that has to be thought through as to what affordability truly looks like in Saskatchewan. And to be clear then, what affordability looks like in Saskatchewan may not be the same as what it looks like in BC or or in another jurisdiction. But I would say to you though, there's going to be a lot of similarities from jurisdiction to jurisdiction as we figure out that affordability piece. And then of course, let's get into this here. This is, what is near and dear, I'm sure, to all of your hearts, and that is, how do we develop our workforce and support our workforce? I work closely with SECA, with Georgia at SECA, and we have, both Morna and Chris referenced it, we have what's called our Saskatchewan Leaders Caucus, which is organized and supported by the Canadian Child Care Federation. And so I hear the realities that childcare programs in Saskatchewan face. And to be clear, they're not unlike a lot of other childcare programs across Canada, but that's small support when you know how significant and challenging these issues are. We know that our sector, especially coming through the pandemic, has suffered a lot of job losses across Canada, that the sector itself has struggled through the pandemic to keep its doors open, to keep providing services, to get access to PPE, and to be considered, right, as a part of the system that is worthy of support. We've been told childcare is essential, but we haven't necessarily seen those follow-up supports in terms of, like I said, PPE and even compensation, if you will, and funding to keep the doors open in a sufficient way. So within that, then, of course, we need a workforce. We need all of you. We need all of you and more. Clearly, if we're going to create over 12,000 spaces in the near future, and then more than or 28,000 by the end of 2025-26, that's a lot of people. And we know that our sector, again, is moving off to other jobs because they can get paid better money working perhaps retail, and that's not a knock against retail, or in some other sector. We know a lot of ECEs and folks in childcare move over to work in the education system, for example. And so we need to then change our thinking, right? We need to make early learning and childcare a career destination. It's not a stopover. It is a career destination, full stop. Because we know that ECEs like their jobs. We know that family childcare providers, when they have supports and they have a network to support the work that they do, that they will stick around providing the valuable service that they do. So within that, we need to really have a focus on quality. So we need to strengthen what is there in terms of the requirements in Saskatchewan and beyond, to make sure that we have quality education, that we are furthering education. The status quo, as we've said, isn't working, right? Saskatchewan has regulations specific to how many EC 2s and 3s need to be in their programs, and we know that so many programs just get an exemption to that requirement because they can't meet it. And we're saying that as we build a system, that is no longer acceptable. We need to be able to create the structures and the support to ensure that programs are meeting their regulated and their licensing requirements, and that we have a proper supply of credentialed ECEs to work in childcare. Of course, with that, we need to be able to fund and support ECE for your education. How do we capture those people already in our sector that want to upgrade? And then we need to make it worthwhile for them to upgrade, because that is one of the things we hear. You all know this, that I would love to do more in my field. I like this job, but why would I go back to school? And not only that, what are the opportunities to go back to school? So that is a critical and essential piece of how we support you in your work. We need ongoing professional learning. We know this. One of the things I'm always amazed with our sector is just their dedication to professional learning. And even, tonight, here we are on a January night on the prairies, and over 40 of you are here tonight to learn about what system building means to you as an ECE and as a family childcare provider and as a workforce. We need to, maybe there was the Federation, our organization, and the Early Childhood Educators of BC a couple of years ago, I guess 3 years ago now, co-hosted a national conference, a national early learning and care conference. Maybe some of you were there, I don't know, in Vancouver. And we brought a keynote speaker over from Norway, as I think Morna and Chris have both mentioned, Norway or Sweden and the Scandinavian countries, because they do have very high functioning early learning and care systems. Anyways, one of the things we had Tove, who was her name, Tove Mogstad Sleen, speak about was how do they approach education and ECEs. And that dynamic that she talked about literally had everybody stopped in their tracks as she was talking about the fact that within their structures, they had what they called essentially a lead ECE who would have to have their master's degree in early childhood. And we all looked at that in awe, because that is not how we do it in Canada, right? That is not how we do it at all. And within that, then there was, your master's ECE, and then you had your degreed ECE, and then you had others who are coming up who had mentorship built in through those leaders within their programs. So in other words, it was a well-designed system that supported not only the leaders within the program, but those coming up in their educational journey in pedagogy and so on and so forth. And along with that, right, also leadership in the program. That we don't create executive directors and management of childcare programs by chance either. That has to be done by design. But right now, we leave so much of that to chance. And so certainly then, if we talk about family childcare or home childcare too, there's a base level in Saskatchewan. Is that sufficient? Do we need to enhance that educational requirement and licensing requirements for family and home childcare providers as well? Because certainly, if you listen to the announcement in August between Saskatchewan and the federal government, there is going to be a lot of expansion into family childcare. And so, it really is about raising that bar about education and professional development for all. And then obviously tied to that too is a provincial salary scale, creating and all this, by the way, is a comprehensive workforce strategy. But within that, obviously, what really gets to the heart of it for all of you is a competitive provincial salary scale where everybody is paid a fair wage and have fair benefits. That is so important. So again, we know from research, from data, that people who work in our sector like their jobs. They also, though, want to be recognized for the uniqueness of their skills, the uniqueness of their education, and be compensated fairly for that. So within that, there has to be a provincial salary scale that is done purposely and will help to not only retain the workforce that Saskatchewan has, early childhood workforce, but recruit. Again, on that theme of making this a career destination. And as Morna talked about, which is so important, is improving the overall working conditions of ECEs in the sector. We know that has to happen, and that's not unique to Saskatchewan. That is something that is so typical across Canada. And there's lots of pieces that go into that. But most certainly, it's also tying to professional development. Is there time? So much of this work, this professional development that you do, it's on an evening, right? Just like tonight, or on a weekend. If we go to somewhere like PEI actually has 2 days a year that the sector shuts down and they go for professional development, typically a conference. That is an absolute leading edge way of supporting ECEs in that province. Manitoba has it that you can also shut down for 1 day to attend the Manitoba Childcare Association conference. Those are small things, but if we look to the education sector and we look at the fact that they shut down throughout the school year so that teachers can go and improve their professional development and their practice, that is something that we have to have in our minds too. What does our sector need to improve the practice and the professionalism of our sector that in turn supports quality and the education and care of young children? And of course, tied with that is the development of our professional profiles, being recognized as professionals with a unique set of skills and abilities, as I said moments ago, and who is doing what in what programs. Do we have pedagogical leaders? Do we have really great managers that are great at HR and things like that? These are all things that need to be in place as we continue to build out a system. And Morna, I think Chris as well talked about it. I mean, let's look at the education system. I'm not saying to you it's a perfect system, but they do have those roles built in within their system to support children with special needs, to support newcomer families, for example, to support all sorts of different needs that come up. And you know this, you see the needs of the children and the families in your communities, and how we often as a sector fall short of meeting those needs despite our incredible goodwill and intention to do better by them. So moving forward, and we're going to get into the questions here in just a moment, we are doing things like this webinar here today to support all of you and to help you learn. We're going to be doing more of this. I know Childcare Now is doing a webinar in I think a couple weeks roughly, or was it even next week, talking about rural childcare. And I think that, by the way, I just want to pause there for a moment. I know it's hard in the larger areas in Saskatchewan, like Saskatoon and Regina, etc., to staff childcare programs properly. I know how it's even harder in the rural areas, in the remote areas, to staff childcare programs and to find credentialed ECEs to work in those programs. So these are really, really important discussions. And as Morna said, this is about bringing in other stakeholders too, and a whole government approach, right? Because this isn't just about our sector. This is about building that broader base, because this isn't just about childcare as a single entity, but just its impact, and it's important to every corner of society and every corner of the economy, right? We also know, and I think this has been said a few times, and I know you want all of this to happen now, especially the workforce part, and especially wage grids and things like that. And I don't disagree with you, but it will take time because we have to get it right. We have to get this right, and we have to do it really well. So that's why your involvement, your input as we go forward are going to be so important to this. And keep in mind too, right, this is happening across Canada. We are learning from other jurisdictions what's happening there. We see the good, we see the challenging, and we see the not so good. And we know that this is about building a better Saskatchewan and a better Canada for all children and families, right? That if you think about it this way, if you as a family move from one province to another, and let's just say you've got two children, maybe their ages 3 and 6, when you move to a new community, you can be assured that that new community for your 6-year-old will have a school space, right? School is a right for families in Canada and children in Canada. But that 3-year-old, if they need childcare, good luck, right? We know waiting lists are a challenge. We know finding high quality care that is affordable is really a challenge. And one of the things that came out of our consultations in Saskatchewan was that we need to be looking at this from a children's rights perspective. That if a family moves or any sort of situation that, and I think Chris said it earlier, that 3-year-old will be able with their family to find a space that meets their needs, and it's local, hopefully, and is affordable and really high quality, no different than that 6-year-old who is now going into a local school. That's the way we have to think about this. So finally, even though we're going to send it to you, there's lots of places to find this roadmap and lots of information out there specific to childcare. You can go to Childcare Now's website, you go to our website, go to SECA's website, go to Muttart Foundation's website. You're going to find the roadmap there, and you're going to find a whole lot more information there as well. So with that, Chris and Morna, we'll get to the questions here. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and just going to move that there, and I'm going to just get to some questions here for us. All right. Just bear with me as I pull them out. All right. Are you seeing them, by the way, Morna and Chris? Are you seeing the questions? Yeah. All right. So we got two, actually, or three here from Jessica. So we'll just start at the top here. So if the wage, oh, sorry, I got out. I'm not sure. So if the wage grid being pushed right now is from bilateral monies, will there be further compensation for ECEs using the new agreements monies? Maybe Chris, I'll start with you and then move over to Morna for an answer on that.
Thanks for the question, Jessica. So initially what's been put on the table, and it's appreciated, but it's not the long-term answer, is wage enhancements. So those one-time wage enhancements, the $1, $2, $3, they are the monies from the bilateral agreement. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So looking ahead at the system building agreement, that's that 15.7 million in the first 2 years to look at moving towards a provincial salary scale, salary grid. And so I think it's fair to say in the plan, the action plan says that work's going to start on that salary grid in 22, 23. So probably the earliest that salary scale is going to be in place is probably 23, 24. So the one-time wage enhancements, that's bilateral money. What we anticipate in that second action plan, that $800 million that's available, some significant portion of that is going to be allocated to the development of a competitive provincial salary scale. So I'll stop there, and happy to have Morna and Don provide further comment, and Georgia and Karen too.
Yeah.
The only thing I'd like to add is to just comment on sort of what processes or mechanisms we think are effective in ensuring proper compensation of early childhood educators and others who work in early learning and childcare. In almost all jurisdictions, governments have addressed in one way or another to some extent problems of compensation, because they do recognize that we have a problem of low pay. There's not as much recognition, I would suggest, as a problem of not having adequate non-wage compensation, like proper benefit plans and access to pensions and so forth. But there has been some recognition, and in most jurisdictions, governments have addressed them in what's called wage top-ups or wage enhancements and so forth. This is not what we would want to see. This is an area where we think transformation, very different approach is necessary. So, you know, as John has said, and as what's really clear in our roadmap, is what we want to see is that funding formulas, operational funding formulas for childcare services and programs be reorganized, rethought, and that that programs be fully funded, sufficiently funded to provide for high quality inclusive programs. And that includes sufficiently funded to pay proper compensation and a full range of benefits. So that is not what's happening right now. And so that is an important aspect that we need to push for. It's addressed in the roadmap. And we don't know which way. This is one of the big challenges that we're experiencing in almost every jurisdiction, is that we don't have those details. And I know there's some questions about how do we make sure that early childhood educators' voices get heard directly as governments make these decisions, and it's a really important question because it has to happen. But that's what the roadmap sets a view on how compensation should be addressed. Of course, we want provincial salary grids, but we want more than salary. We want we want full compensation, proper compensation, and we have to make sure that it's not stagnant. I mean, we're dealing with the highest levels of inflation right now that our country, I think, has seen now for 30 years. So, you know, we can't even do it. I know that some advocates in some jurisdictions have been, you know, calling for $23 an hour, $25 an hour. Well, that was 5 years ago. So it needs to be, you know, we need processes with active engagement and involvement of the sector through their associations, their professional association, for ongoing review. And we need a mechanism to build in adequate compensation into funding. Otherwise, the fragility and the underpay is going to continue.
Yeah, so true, Morna. And in terms, and Jessica, the wage scale. So that what's out there now is, you know, as I said earlier, I think as best can be described as a wage floor. That is by no means, as Morna just talked about, where this needs to stop. It's an initiative to you know, try to level out the playing field, if you will, in Saskatchewan, but by no means is this where that thing should end up. This, because it's just started, right? The province of Saskatchewan has not gone around and you know, consulted with all of you or you know, or with really anybody to this point in terms of helping develop a salary or provincial wage scale. And so there's a lot of work to be done there, and by no means, you know, should we be looking at that as the goal being achieved, by no means. So maybe more to the next one. I'll start with you, and then maybe Georgia, I'll get you to in on this as well, if you don't mind. How can ECEs find a place at the table to be heard? I appreciate the advocacy work by organizations, but how do we get input from those who are frontline and working on the floor day after day? Great question. Morna?
Well, I think Georgia's probably best positioned to answer this question practically, but I will just tell you maybe philosophically, or sort of my approach is that what you don't do is wait to be invited. You demand to be heard, and you know that through your professional association, through other organizations. There are staff who are unionized, and unions are an effective voice as well. We're all members of different organizations, and it's good to be represented, as you say, by advocacy organizations. But what's really important is the individual voices be heard, but also the individuals join other individuals to be sure that it's a collective voice, one way or the other. So demand forums, demand attention, and create forums, because they're not necessarily going to be offered. And this is one of the things we want to do with this roadmap, is create opportunities for voices to be heard directly. So that means organizing forums and inviting people. And if they don't show up, my favorite tactic is to have organized forums, invite government and policymakers, set out the chairs, put their names in the chairs, and if they don't show up, everybody will know that they don't show up. Take photographs, use social media, and maybe the next time they'll accept the invitation or agree to a direct meeting. So those are all some tactics.
Great. Thanks, Morna. I like that. Yeah, Georgia, do you want to add to that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I just have to say I really enjoyed that, Morna, as well, and I think I might use that tactic in the future as well. So as Morna mentioned, joining your professional association in your province is so important. That is one way to absolutely have your voice heard. Aside from that, it's your own language as well. There's so many times that I hear, I'm just an ECE, and I say, you are not just an ECE, you are an ECE. And this ties back to Morna's conversation as well in demand to be heard. Advocacy really starts with you as an individual, and having those conversations with your family members or your friends when they say, what do you do? You're not just an ECE. You support children in their growth and development. You are the future through these children. And so aside from using your voice to speak up with your friends and family and anyone that will listen, really, joining a professional organization and having the confidence, and hopefully you're supported by your professional association, to send letters to your MLA, to call them, to send emails. Every voice matters. And as Morna once again said, if we have a collective message together, they're going to hear thousands of voices saying the same thing. So that is our hope as your professional organization in our province. Is we want you to feel supported and confident in your own advocacy work as well with that collective voice. So if you have questions about joining the CECA, please let me know. There's my pitch.
Perfect. No, that's great. Thanks.
Can I just
go ahead,
add
Karen?
something?
Yeah,
I
please.
just absolutely everything that was just said, but I also think, you know, CECA has sent out some surveys. The SAS Leaders Caucus has sent out surveys. Please, they matter. That is your voice, and a lot of times we take that information. It may be small, but it all adds to the data that's provided. So whenever there's a survey, whether it's from the ministry, whether it's from CECA or any organization related to Childcare Now Sask, Childcare Now National, anything, please take the time and encourage your coworkers and your peers to complete those, because it's information, it's knowledge, it's data, and we need data. Data drives everything. They want to see numbers, they want to see words, they want to. So please take that time to do that.
Great, thanks, Karen. Chris, I'm going to jump to the last question that came in here, because I think this is really one of the heart of when we talk about supply side funding, and really that shift in thinking on how services are funded. So I'm going to start with you here. So a great question about this. We know that childcare programs and homes have different fees. How does the government want to make that initial 50% reduction in parent fees and take into account those discrepancies in those fees? And then how that, Chris, I'll add a little bit to this, how does that impact then system building and funding of services?
Thanks, Don, and thanks for the question. And just to go back to the ECEs, I mean, all of us on this call, we do have a chance to speak to federal and provincial ministers, and I will tell, next time I speak to the federal minister, I will tell her ECEs want to hear. They want to tell you what they need to say, and so I'll just stop there. So to go back to the bottom question, really good question. And as when Don was talking through the financing, the slide referenced the funding formula, and what the funding formula represents is how do we actually determine what the real cost of providing high quality early learning and childcare is in a family childcare home in, I'll use Weyburn since that's where George is looking. How do we determine what that cost is in Prince Albert? How do we determine what it is in a day home that's serving children who maybe have exceptional needs? That's where the funding formula is critical. And what the provincial government did in Saskatchewan, and it did the same in Alberta, it calculated the initial parent fee reduction grants based on the average cost of childcare fees, right? That's not very discrete, that's not very sensitive. So what the provincial government needs to do as part of moving forward, it needs to redevelop that supply side funding model and say, how do we actually calculate what the legitimate cost, and this is what Mona said last time as well, not what the legitimate cost of providing childcare is now, but what's the cost of providing high quality early learning childcare? And then it needs to develop a funding formula based on that. So if you think of the way schools are funded, schools have base operating grants. So maybe there's a base operating component to a funding formula, and maybe then there's supplemental operating formula calculations. I've got more children with exceptional needs. I'm in an isolated, hard to serve community. I'm in a very expensive downtown location, so on and so on. The funding formulas should reflect the cost of providing high quality early learning childcare, no matter where that service is being provided. And as we all know, an average meets nobody's needs, right? So if I'm a size 9 and Don's a size 10, and all they've got is 9.5, doesn't work for Don or I. And so the government needs to take time. And as what we all know, the affordability piece was the big political piece. And I think it's fair to say that governments in Saskatchewan and Alberta, they've hurried the affordability piece. And now we need to go back to them and say, it's really important that early learning and childcare is affordable for families, but it's also really important that the funding reflects the cost of delivering high quality early learning child, no matter the model of delivery, no matter where the model of delivery, no matter the types of children and families that are being served. So I'll just stop there. I'm happy to hear the comments of others.
Morna, do you want to jump in on that?
I just make a brief comment because I think it really is a good question, and it certainly is a puzzle. How different governments are calculating this average 50%. They go by, sometimes they say, and they use different language. I've noticed the federal government sometimes slips and says parents will see their fees reduced by 50%. Well, that's not, you know, and then this expectation gets set up. I don't think that is what's happening in Saskatchewan. I don't think that's what's happening in many jurisdictions. Parents are not necessarily, and in fact, some parents, I know this to be the case in Alberta, are seeing their fees being reduced by a very low small percentage, and others are seeing very high percentages. And interestingly enough, it's the higher income families who are seeing their fees reduced by the higher percentage, because the way it works now with the subsidy system, they're paying more. So it's, I think this is an example to me where governments make statements, they have their objectives. This is why I think the roadmap is so important. It's really important that we say, this is what we want. Sure, the government has said they're going to be reducing fees by an average of 50% and down to an average of $10 a day. And that's fine. I think we should just see it as, okay, that's their objective. What I hear is they're going to reduce fees. What we need to push for is to make sure that it's affordable. And also we have to make sure that fees are not the major source of revenue, and they in fact represent a very small percentage of revenue for the childcare system, and that it's seen as revenue to the government, not as revenue to individual providers. In other words, providers should no longer be reliant on parent fees in any way or matter. The government can recoup some of their costs by charging parent fees, but that's what that should be about. Programs have to be fully funded. So it's just, the question is a really good one, and I would just say, I think it's almost rhetorical question in the sense is that you really thinking this doesn't make much sense or it's not going to work, and that's a good, I think, critical perspective to have. And so what we have to say is, what do we want? And of course it's going to take some time. We can't drop fees dramatically. Well, they could, but I just don't think there's probably enough money right now on the table to be able to do that, and there's other improvements that need to be done. So those are just my comments on that question. A really good one, but it does raise, we have to be really cautious about not getting caught into a government frame and its goals. That's what the roadmap is about. The roadmap is saying, what do we think makes sense? What system change do we think needs to happen? Government might have different ideas, but through this roadmap, if we can all agree to where we want to go, that helps get the government where we want them to go, as opposed to just accepting where they've decided to go.
Great point, Morna. And, you know, Karen, I'll ask you, you know, Morna brought up something really important there. And so, you know, I don't know if I know this webinar was geared more to ECEs and family and home childcare providers. So maybe I'm speaking a little more to them, Karen, like the family and home childcare providers, but I'll speak to you as well. But, you know, I'm not sure that I know of any executive director or anybody running a childcare program that wakes up every morning saying, man, I can't wait to collect fees from my parents today, because that's just a wonderful part of my job. Hey, Karen, do you want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, I don't think there are too many, you know, in fact, we're always looking for ways not to. But I had a parent advisory committee meeting tonight, and we were talking about the fee reduction and the wage enhancement grants and whatnot, and I was just giving them some information. And it's always about looking for ways not to increase fees, right? But when we're talking about the value of the educators and the challenges with hiring qualified educators right now, and that is increasing, you know, that's gotten increasingly tough with COVID for sure. One of the comments was, well, you know, we need to pay them more, and it's like, absolutely we do. Like I literally every year, my entire 19 years as an ECE in this field, I have gone to HR. I have gone to my boss, whether it's a VP of admin or VP of education, and I have said, we need to pay more. And I've been lucky. I have a responsive organization that works with that. But it has been every year. But at the end of the day, there's still only so much money in that pot. And we, like, probably 99% of our fees go to salary. So how do we increase it? How do we increase it without going in the hole, right? And I am lucky because I'm part of a larger organization. Other centers, smaller centers, like, I don't know how they do it. I truly don't. And it is hats off to every one of them. But it's a challenge, and we all struggle because we are all vying for those same staff. And so I recognize that an organization like mine, who is able to pay more, has an advantage. And that's not the way it should be. It just isn't. And so it needs to be better. Because every director wants to have affordable fees. Every director wants to pay their staff. I know that. I really am confident in that.
Yeah, I'll just interject. And we'll do one more question here, but just a personal opinion on this, but I think it echoes what Morna said and what Karen said. I used to run childcare programs, and it always seemed contrary to me that you were asking families to pay fees that were quite often so unaffordable to them, yet providing such an essential service to their economic well-being and to the well-being and education and care of their child. And we all know that situation. If a family can't afford it and they fall into arrears, how do you balance that with the need of that family and the essential nature of quality early learning and care? It just seems so contradictory to me. So I'll just leave that there. Chris, one more question here, and I think this is another really good one, because Saskatchewan has talked about really expanding in the family childcare sector and the home childcare sector. Will there be more support to bring folks from the unlicensed, unregulated sector into the licensed, regulated sector?
Okay, and I think, again, that question can be applied to other provinces as well. And so I think when you look at the expansion, I mean, I think it's fair to say provinces are looking at family childcare as part of the service model that can be expanded to support children and families. So the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what is the best model of family childcare to do that? And how can we support childcare providers providing high quality early learning childcare for all children and families that want it? And so there are different models. So just to put one model on the table, not to say it's the panacea, but to say in other provinces, there's a family childcare agency model where early learning and childcare family providers are connected to an agency. That agency then provides some structure and support to them as individual providers, and that helps them through the licensing process, helps them come into the system. There are also models where we have a center-based childcare system, a service provider that also works with a network of family childcare providers. So what we try to do, we try to identify, first of all, what are the barriers that are preventing family childcare providers coming into the regulated system, and how do we overcome those barriers? But as we overcome their barriers, what's absolutely critical is that we're all committed to providing high quality early learning and childcare for children, no matter the model of delivery. So I think this is one where SACA and the Leaders Caucus and Childcare now in the Federation, we need to say, let's talk through this together and let's identify what are the challenges, what are the barriers, and then let's think through the solutions, because there will not be a single solution. There will be a series of solutions. Maybe it's a network of family childcare providers connected to a big agency. Maybe it's a family childcare agency model. Maybe it's some other informal connection between family childcare providers themselves. But we need to think through the models, because I think it's quite clear the provincial government doesn't know the answer to that question. People on this call know some of the answer, and the more times we talk to each other about it, we'll actually get a better policy answer. And we'll get an answer that respects the values and the commitments of this early learning and childcare sector in Saskatchewan. It may be a different answer in Alberta, where we have a family childcare agency model. It may be a different answer in BC. So let's talk about what the barriers are, and let's talk about where we want to go and work out what the solution looks like. But let's do it together. and let's do it based on evidence. So I'll just stop there. Thanks, Tom.
Morna, last word on that to you. Yeah, I'll pivot to you, Georgia. Just, yeah. Morna, to you.
I very much agree, echo what Chris says. You know, I think that one of the challenges we all have is it's hard for us to really imagine and think about these questions about what family childcare could look like in a fully funded, government-supported environment, both for family childcare, but also center-based childcare. So, you know, we can look to other jurisdictions that have full-fledged, very mature, universal systems of early learning and childcare. When we look at those systems, center-based care is very different, and so is family childcare. And it's actually makes up a very small percentage of the spaces. So we have to, but we're not there. We're not anywhere near a full mature system. So we have to go from where we are now, and we have to look ahead. We're going to have to constantly reevaluate. I think we need much more engagement as advocacy organizations, professional organizations with this sector, because I think it is one that governments are looking to expand, to be able to meet their targets of growth. But we have some, it's going to be very tricky because it's also the sector where there is most turnover, in the sense that providers come on stream, so to speak, and then their situations change. So it's not a stable source of childcare, and those who work in that environment are really under-resourced and under-supported. So I am in favor of an agency model, but it's something that needs to be discussed, and as Chris says, it's going to look. So that's another example through the roadmap discussions. Let's have that discussion. It's very important.
Yeah, great. Georgia, last word to you.
Yes, absolutely. So I just wanted to include my comments on that piece in regards to home-based early learning and childcare. We know that in our province, the Ministry of Education has opened up more positions for consultants, and they are currently taking applications, but they're licensing agents. It is not true full support for early learning and childcare home providers. And so I just really appreciate everything that Morna and Christopher said in that regard, because they need overarching support, not just how many windows do I need in my basement to open my home to childcare. So thank you both so much for those comments on different models and engaging the sector as well. So John, is that all the questions then today?
Yeah, I think we caught the theme of all the questions there, Georgia, as I'm seeing it. Yeah.
Lovely. Okay, and we are a few minutes after 8:30, but I just wanted to share something. A participant tonight sent me a message as Dawn and Morna were talking about not leaving it up to chance, and something resonated with this participant. And it's a quote. It says, "You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the levels of your systems." And that's by James Clear through Atomic Habits. He's the author of Atomic Habits. And I think that that is truly astounding for tonight, and a great way to end tonight, because if we want better results, we need to forget about the goal setting. We really need to focus on the system instead, and that's exactly what this roadmap does, and that's exactly what these conversations do in moving us forward. So we need to focus on the system that leads to those positive results. So thank you so much, Brittany, for sharing that quote with me. Thank you, Dawn, Morna, Christopher, and Karen for everything tonight. Your presentation, as always, is just phenomenal. You are all a wealth of knowledge, and I appreciate you all taking the time this evening to speak to everyone. And last, I'd like to thank all of the ECEs and home providers and anyone really that joined us tonight. I know you work full-time jobs and you are still here on your own time in the evening, so thank you for being here. Thank you for looking to find your voice and to support this growth in the system. And last but not least, thank you for the work that you do for the children of our province. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a great night. I felt like Santa Claus saying that. Have a great night, everybody.
Everybody.